Welcome to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we are talking with David Broder. He is the president of SEIU 512 here in Virginia. Thank you so much, David, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine.
So we've spoken before on more than one occasion, but this is the first time we've spoken post-pandemic, and what a year this has been. And when we talk about the value of unions and what unions provide to workers here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I don't think there's ever been a time in history, not in my lifetime, where we have seen how there are incredible disparities among workers here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and how that was laid bare, and the importance of having things that protect workers from exploitation, not just during global pandemics, but during the course of their work lives. So let's reintroduce you for people who may not know you as well as I do, and how you came to have such a passion for doing this work of unions here in Virginia.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm eager to dive in, and because I think you're right, the pandemic has really shown a spotlight on just how fragile our economy can be, and yet also how resilient and how powerful workers are in this moment to reconstruct an economy, a healthcare system, a community that benefits all people. But as you said, before we get into that, I always like grounding this in my own family story, because it is why I believe so strongly in the idea that workers should have rights. Because I think that is really the story of my family. So my family came to this country, as so many of us did, as immigrants in the early 20th century. My great-grandparents were Jews who fled the pogroms and the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe came to America in hope of a better life. And our family story really is about entering the American middle class, because in part we became to be seen as white people, and there's an important history about tackling racism in our country, and also because they were dedicated public servants and union members. Union contracts really helped my family. So my grandparents were public employees and union members. It was their union contract that ensured that my father could go to college, that he could become a therapist and a professor. My mother, growing up, she was an elementary school art teacher. She was active in our union. She used to take us to put up her students' art around town in community centers, and then she would take us to phone banks and rallies with the union. And her union contract really meant that my brother and I, that we had food on the table and that we could see a doctor whenever we needed to, and that we never had to choose between the two. And when she retired a few years ago after a career dedicated to children and to families, her pension from her union contract today means that she can enjoy her retirement, that she can age with dignity, and that our family isn't worried about what will happen to her. And so very clearly, my family wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here today talking to you without strong unions, as well as a community and elected leaders who were committed to supporting workers and workers' rights. And I'm also here because I'm really concerned about the direction our nation is going in. And this was even before the pandemic. I worry about the future. I worry about the economy that my daughters, who are 8 and 5 years old, will inherit. I want for them what any parent wants, what we want for all our daughters and sons, for all our kids and grandkids. It's what I had as a kid. I want for them economic security. I want healthcare that won't bankrupt them. I want good schools. I want them to have parents who, as my parents did, worked hard, but also were around, right? That was the American dream. And that dream seems further and further away for so many of us as we head towards an economy filled with gig jobs that don't come with benefits. And again, as we said at the top, also recognizing that racist laws and practices meant that the American dream was never attainable for so many of our Black and Brown API and immigrant friends and family. And yet, by having strong unions, by negotiating strong contracts, by having the support of the community, we can make sure that every kid, that every family can thrive. And so I really am grateful to be here today to talk more about that.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about, how we look at the health of our economy. Generally, it's measured by the health of business. And so even here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, chambers of commerce, for instance, the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce, just as an example, we'll talk about how Virginia is one of the 5 best states for business in the United States, and that each of those 5 states that is best for business is also a right to work state, which kind of implies that you can't be a state that's good for workers and good for business. And I think that's just a lot of hooey, a great deal of hooey, but it seems to be a dominant narrative. And what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think I'm with you on the amount of hooey it is. I think they're just wrong. And the good news is that voters across the Commonwealth, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents, agree with you and me, Catherine. Because you may remember in 2016, when right to work was on the ballot, the only time that I've known in my lifetime where we could actually vote on it, there was a large bipartisan majority that voted right to work down, that said, no, we absolutely don't want this. This was, believe it or not, this was Clinton voters, this was Trump voters. Who came together and said, no, we don't want right to work. Look, we know there is a role for strong businesses. We just think that there should also be strong, good jobs. We think that our economy is stronger when everybody who works hard, right, should make a living wage, a family sustaining wage. $15 is just the start. Right? That means $30,000 a year if you're working full time, if you get those hours. There's no way that anyone can live in our community on $30,000 a year, right? So we think you should make enough money to raise a family. We think you should get to go see a doctor without bankrupting that family. We think that when your kid gets sick, you should be able to take a day off, have them see a doctor, be with them without missing a paycheck. Right? And we think that at the end of your career, after a lifetime of service, whether in one job or many, you should be able to retire and age with dignity. That, we think, is the measure of a healthy economy. And when the economy has done well for everyone, that's what we've seen, right? And so we think that Virginia can be the best place for families, and that means workers and for businesses.
You hit on something super important there. And for those of you just joining us, you are listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are speaking with David Broder, the president of SEIU 512, a wonderful union here in Virginia, and one that has worked diligently for so many years to ensure that workers across the Commonwealth of Virginia, but here in Northern Virginia, have what they need to thrive as employees and to support a healthy economy. And so one of the things, you talk about the $15 minimum wage, a living wage. We saw this year that, it was raised to $9.50 here in Virginia. Elections matter. Who sits in the legislature matters. Who sits in the governor's mansion matters, because that is how we get things like an increased minimum wage in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But you also talk about sick days, paid sick days, which home health care workers never had until now. Like, what, they don't get sick just because they're taking care of other people? They don't get sick? And paid sick leave, paid family leave, affordable child care. These are all the things that are hurdles for the workforce. And the private industry has not addressed them. And up to this point, our government has not addressed them. And so labor unions have been that body that goes in to say, in an industry, we are going to be that organization that says we are going to give you the fundamental things you need to be a good worker, to build a good business, and to support a healthy economy.
You hit the nail on the head, Catherine, and I think you just described the sort of core principle of the labor movement, which is solidarity, right? An injury against one is an injury against all. We want better pay and benefits for everyone, right? Not just a select few, for everyone. And if you're not moved by the idea that somebody else should have a living wage or healthcare, I think the pandemic reminded us how intrinsically linked we are. And maybe you think it's not your problem that a home care worker doesn't have paid sick days. But during the pandemic, we saw that that almost a majority of Americans don't have a single paid sick day, don't have paid family medical leave, don't have the ability to go see a doctor, or maybe right now are afraid to go get a vaccine because of their immigration status. These are not problems for someone else. Let's be clear, they never were. But the pandemic has shown us that these are actually public health crises. And that if we had a system where everyone could have afforded to stay home when the pandemic hit, it's not that we wouldn't have had the pandemic, but I believe we wouldn't have seen 600,000 plus deaths. We wouldn't have seen the devastation to communities and the economy. I think we can no longer ignore the basic tenets of solidarity, which is we get ahead by everyone getting ahead.
You know, Henry Ford famously said, you have to pay people enough so that they can buy the thing that they produce. I mean, that seems to me like such an obvious thing, you know, and yet workers today are working in places where they can't buy the thing that they produce, or, you know, they can't eat in the restaurant where they work, or, you know, they cannot afford, you know, anything because they earn so little. And yet we have had an administration in the previous 4 years who spoke as if the stock market was the measure of how well America and Americans were doing. And that was such a false narrative. And yet I found that the media just kind of went right on along with that and reported it as if it was truth or factual or legitimate. And to my way of thinking, it wasn't. It was never. So few people own stocks. You know, executives make obscene executive wages. And we've got people who work at, for instance, Walmart, who have to rely on nonprofits, like the one I sit on the board of, for things like housing assistance and utility assistance and food assistance. You know, why are we have so many nonprofits supporting people who desperately need food and housing, and they're working for companies who have high return on to their investors, and management and executives making obscene amounts of money. And why does this country, the average person, not think that this is a problem?
Absolutely. And I think there has been a movement that has been very intentional for decades, right? Sponsored by big corporate right-wing interests to have us not think about this. It's not so long ago that there used to be a labor section in the newspaper, but I think many people listening right now never grew up reading one, right? We only read the business section. Many of us went to schools in this community, wonderful schools, but we're never taught about the labor movement. We're never taught about unions. We're never, as we just recently learned, we're never taught about Juneteenth, right? There's so much of our history that we have really intentionally not been taught. And I think that's about workers' rights. I think that is about the civil rights movement, about the contributions of Black and brown and immigrant Americans. We're really intentionally not told our history. And so I think we need to be very intentional about lifting up the kind of community that we want. One in which everybody gets ahead, one in which our local teachers, our firefighters, our librarians, our carpenters can afford to live in the community. Because what happens when our workers, our workforce in the community has to commute an hour here? What happens when they're no longer invested in the community? It really hurts everyone. And so, you know, I think if you ask somebody what they wanted for their community, for their neighborhood, they would talk about every family succeeding. And again, that's really what the labor movement is about. And I'll say this, Catherine, I think that the pandemic forced us to look at this. The pandemic did not cause this. COVID did not cause the fragility of our economy, but it forced us to examine it. It forced us to take a hard look at what many of us had grown so accustomed to. We could no longer ignore the fact that workers were called essential, but treated as expendable, right? It forced us to take a look on the fact that too many Americans, as we've said, lack basic benefits. We're talking about a single paid sick day, let alone full health care, paid family medical leave, or retirement. And that Black and Brown, API, and immigrant communities disproportionately lack these benefits. So it is no surprise that we are seeing COVID ravage certain communities and not others. The pandemic made it impossible to ignore that care workers, as you lifted up, whether they're home care workers who care for older adults or people with disabilities, or child care workers who care for my kids and others, that they're overworked, they're underpaid, that they're the backbone of our entire economy, right? It's care work that makes all work possible for other families. And I think it made it impossible to ignore that women continue to bear the brunt of family caregiving without any kind of meaningful help from their jobs or from government programs. None of this was created by the pandemic, but we are forced to see this. And I think we are coming together in Virginia and nationally to name it, to address it, and to create real solutions.
I agree. For those of you who are just listening to this show, it's Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are speaking with David Broder, who is the president of SEIU 512 here in Virginia. So you bring up something important. We talk about childcare. So many women had no choice because someone had to be home with the children while they were doing distance learning. And now that, the kids are going back to school in the fall. That has been determined, especially here in Virginia, where it was legislated that children are going back to school in the fall. But, people can't return to their jobs unless they have childcare. And so it's interesting to me, again, how the national messaging has been hijacked with Republican governors saying, well, we're going to withhold the additional federal unemployment benefits because people aren't going back to work because they just don't want to work, which to me is just so insulting, first of all, just so insulting that people, you can't live on unemployment benefits. For anyone who's never had unemployment benefits, you can't live on them. And yet people have to have childcare to go back to their jobs. But I don't see the media talking or interviewing or doing the stories on people who would like to go back to work and know that they have affordable, safe childcare for their children since school is out for the summer. Those are not the stories. I guess I just am perplexed, continually perplexed as to why we pick and choose which gets to, what gets to be the dominant narrative here.
It's such a good point. And I would happily challenge any governor anywhere of any party who says people don't want to work because they're getting $300 extra in unemployment benefits. I would challenge any of them to take a frontline service job or a frontline care job. See how long they lasted. See what it was like when they lacked a single paid sick day, when they had to work for tips. My guess is real quick, you would see tipped workers covered by the minimum wage. You'd see universal paid family medical leave. You'd see universal health care really fast in those states. But you're right, Catherine, why don't we have these narratives about what's happening? And I will say, and I'm proud that the labor movement in many ways is also aligning with and helping to lead the movement for racial justice. Because I think this is what structural racism looks like in our economy and in our narratives. Because so much of care work, since the foundation of this country, when it wasn't work, right, when it was done by slaves, so much of this work still to this day is done by Black and brown women, is done by immigrant women, whether it's childcare, whether it's home care. Not everyone, it's a large multi-racial workforce, but because so much of it is done by Black and brown women, we as a society devalue it. And whatever we say, or we lift it up, and we have lovely words that we use about care workers, and they're meant well. We call them angels, right? We talk about them as members of our family, and they are. But the truth is, as a society, we don't value them because we don't pay care workers a living wage. We don't offer training or benefits. We don't offer a retirement. We don't value it as a community. And it's because it's done traditionally by Black and brown women. And I think this is a really good example of how structural racism hurts all of us. It hurts all of us. It hurts Black, brown, white, API, all of us who will either give care or receive care at one point in our life. And we have to do better. And I've got to say, we're incredibly excited that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made care work a centerpiece of their campaign and their governing, that they had a $400 billion investment proposed as part of the American Jobs Plan, and that now Congress has introduced the Better Care, Better Jobs Act to invest in home care for older adults, people with disabilities, and their care workers. We are calling on Congress to pass this piece of legislation. We're thrilled that Senator Kaine has signed on to it. And we will be rallying 5,000 care workers and family members and allies in DC next Tuesday, July 13th. We invite anyone who is interested in this to join us. And I believe that you can go to careisessential.org for more information. That is careisessential.org for more information on the July 13th rally.
And that's so important to raise that up, David, because, people don't think about healthcare workers as being in a union, just like a lot of people don't necessarily think of firefighters as being in a union or school teachers. But the reason that these people, make a basic wage and have protections in their work is because of things like collective bargaining. It's being able as a group to say that there are minimum standards required for them to work in the industries in which they are. And healthcare, especially home healthcare, even though, as you point out, so many of our family members particularly who are older or who have disabilities and are, they need this is essential to families to have this kind of support and care. And yet we're not thinking about who these people are, or just like firefighters and teachers, ensuring that they have their basic needs met and that the environments in which they work are safe and supported. So I love this idea that there's going to be something in DC on July 13th. I hope people will really pay attention, because you may not think you need home healthcare workers now, but the eventuality is that as we get older, all of us, we may find that we'll be grateful that this industry is protected by a union. And I think, build it before you need it, ladies and gentlemen, build it before you need it. For those of you who are just joining, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are speaking with SEIU 512's president, David Broder. So, you touched briefly on, Jim Crow era, policies, for instance, tipped workers. And every time I talk to, let's say, a chef in New York City, which I did a couple of weeks ago, about the fact that tipped workers are a vestige of Jim Crow. And a lot of people, even in that industry, are not aware of that. And I'm like, it's time for it to go. Restaurants, all of us have seen Help Wanted. We've all heard you can't hire anybody. It's not because people don't want to work. It's because they can't afford to work in terrible jobs. So, how do we finally get rid of this? Ideas on that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you pointed that out. So much of the economy that we have today has its roots in Jim Crow, right? Or slavery. And we don't think about it. And in part, we're not taught about it. But whether it's tipped workers, and I'm so proud that Virginia has advanced a bill to put us on a path to $15 an hour minimum wage. But we also have to remember that it excludes tipped workers and it excludes farm workers. And we are seeing farm workers literally die all over the country in this heat wave for a few dollars an hour. We have to change that. I'm tremendously proud to be a Virginian. Over the last 2 years, I think we've seen our elected leaders really tackle what is the legacy of racism and slavery and Jim Crow in our Commonwealth. We've seen that in a transformation of laws and tearing down of statues, but we have more work to do. I'll pause just to shout out the leadership of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, who have done such extraordinary work that benefits all of us. Delegate Bagby, Senator McClellan, Delegate Price, so many others. You get in trouble when you start naming folks, but so many have been leaders in this area and are really transforming our economy from by applying a racial justice lens and an equity lens to all policies. So, and leading the way in Virginia, becoming the first Southern state to legalize marijuana because there's a disproportionate impact on who's arrested, to repeal the death penalty because the numbers there are deeply disturbing about how the death penalty has been used disproportionately in the Black and Brown community in so many parts of our laws. But we have a long way to go in the economic realm. The minimum wage was a huge first step, but we need to take a look at why do we have so few worker rights? Why do we still have right to work, which absolutely has its roots in the Jim Crow South, in keeping because the 1% knew what they were doing. They didn't want integrated, strong unions. They didn't want white and Black and brown workers realizing that we had common interests and working together. So I'm so proud of what we've done, and I'm really excited about where we're going as a Commonwealth.
Yes, and I'll throw Delegate LaCherice Aird in there just because I love her. And you're right. If you miss somebody, you take a big risk there. But yeah,
absolutely.
The legislative
and Majority Leader Herring, because I'm here in Northern Virginia, we would not be here today without Charnel.
That is so true. And one of the things we're going to take a break here shortly, but one of the things that we need to talk about, especially here in Fairfax County, is the fact that we've attracted lots of headquarters for national organizations. Amazon has its second headquarters here. There's lots of things emerging about Amazon, and I think people need to pay attention to that. Whether you work for the company or you just order a lot of stuff from them, that we're at a turning point where I think the conversation about this one company is going to have this kind of echo ripple effect on us talking about the impact of workers who work for one huge company and what needs to be provided for them. So please stay tuned and join us after the break.
We are Radio Fairfax.
Hello, my name's Matthew Moore, the host of the Psychedelic Circus. The circus has moved. I'm on Sunday nights now from 6 to 8 p.m. Join me for the Psychedelic Circus, where the buzz can shake you clean.
I want to get back to kissing the cheeks of my grandbabies, making Sunday dinner with a house full of family and lots of laughs.
COVID-19 has changed how we live and how we feel. But now, there are vaccines. And they are the very first step that let us get back to what we miss most. It's okay to have questions.
Is it safe?
Should I wait? Now, get the facts. Visit getvaccineanswers.org so you can make an informed decision when vaccines are available to you. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining us today is David Broder, who is the president of SEIU 512 here in Virginia. So when we went on break, we were talking about Amazon. There was an article actually in the New York Times on Tuesday about unionizing shops in various locations, starting in Washington State, which is where Amazon was founded. And the hurdles, there was, it was voted, a union was voted down in Alabama. There were a lot of people watching that. It was very discouraging to see that. But the fact of the matter is, Amazon is an enormous company employing over 1 million people. And so what they do is not insignificant. But to start with the specific and roll this out to whole industries, where there needs to be protections and basic fundamental, benefits and wages and for workers is something I think Americans need to look at and understand that the health of our nation, of our economy, of our communities, and of our families depend on us understanding this, looking at it, and asking the right questions.
Absolutely. And I think some of those questions, again, are what is the community that we want, right? It is not about being anti-Amazon, but the community we want in which there is dignity in all jobs, where everyone who works hard can get ahead, can take care of their families, where we can shop online, but where we also have a strong local economy, where local businesses aren't put out of business by unfair practices around a huge corporation consolidating. I mean, some of Amazon is really the story of unchecked corporate power, and who is it serving? And it is, and look, I have ordered from Amazon. I know people appreciate getting products at decent prices and quickly, but I believe that everyone I've ever talked to would pay an extra $1, would get something the next day if it meant, right, that we could ensure good jobs and strong local communities for everyone. Catherine, everyone should have a voice on the job, and nobody should have to, let's be real here about Amazon. Nobody should have to pee in a bottle because they can't step away from the assembly line, right, for even a moment. There's this idea you mentioned earlier that factory jobs are inherently good jobs. There's nothing about a factory job that makes that true. What happened was workers organized in factories all over the country and took jobs that had been deeply dangerous, jobs where workers were exploited, where there was child labor, and the labor movement turned those into the backbone of the American middle class, made sure that those jobs were safe, that workers had training, had protection, that they had a living wage, that they had a pension. And when the labor movement did that, we saw one of the greatest economic booms in our nation's history. Somehow we're back to these factory jobs being low-wage jobs, jobs without healthcare or benefits, and jobs that are dangerous and bad for your health. We have gone backwards. And that is why we do need to organize Amazon. But it's not just Amazon. Every worker, whatever you do, should have the right to join a union. You should have the right, if you and your coworkers so choose, to negotiate over better pay and benefits. It's what big corporations do every day. We would never tell Amazon, right, that they couldn't negotiate in their business. We shouldn't tell workers that they're not allowed to do the same.
True. And I mean, Amazon has stepped up and pointed out, which they do often, that they raise the starting wage for all of their employees to $15 an hour, which is, that's wonderful. Like, let's go back to Henry Ford. You can pay somebody $15 an hour and they can afford to order something off Amazon. That's good at its core. But the fact of the matter is the working conditions, the way that they're relentlessly measured, the fact that the breaks for the workers or the metrics, whether they're reasonable or not, is not open to negotiation by individual employees. Another industry that, is hospitality. It's not just restaurant workers, which are tipped workers, but the hospitality industry. And I just happen to have an adult child that works in the hospitality industry. They were not considered essential workers, even those who worked in hotels for the entire time that we had the pandemic, and people were coming from all over to stay in these hotels. In my daughter's case, National Guard stayed in her hotel with COVID positive people. But guess what? She was not considered an essential frontline worker, and she was not among the first to get a vaccination. And guess what? You don't have any recourse because no union. So if your employer is not somebody who particularly cares, or the government has not particularly deemed that people who work in hotels are in fact frontline essential workers, then you're kind of SOL, out of luck. So again, people need to be having a different conversation, asking different questions about how this can happen. Why does it happen?
Absolutely. And I think it comes back to the strongest part of the labor movement, which is, again, this simple but profound idea of solidarity, that we are all in it together. Look, those in charge of the economy very much like pitting us against each other. They like determining who has value, who is essential. We often hear that person doesn't deserve to make $15 an hour. We decry and put down the burger flippers, the folks in hospitality. Look, if you want a burger, and I like burgers, right? Then you need somebody to make that burger, and that person should live with dignity. We can no longer allow those at the top to divide us, whether that's using race or gender, ethnicity, immigration status, right? We are often told that people are coming to this country to steal our jobs. It is simply another way that there is an attempt to divide us from each other, because those in charge know that when workers organize across racial lines, across gender, ethnicity, gender identity, language, that's when we really have power. And that's when we can ensure good jobs for all. And so I think that's what this moment is about. I think that in some ways is what the pandemic is reminding us. You are seeing, probably, no doubt, all over the country on social media, you're seeing businesses advertise $15 an hour starting wages. You mentioned Amazon doing it. They're not doing that out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they can't hire anyone. And it's a reminder of how big corporate interests have lobbied against the minimum wage, have kept it at $7.25 for over a decade. They have artificially kept wages low, and workers are rising up and saying, we are not going to take it anymore. And whether they have a formal union to bargain better wages, or whether informally they're just not going to take those jobs, workers have power, and it's benefiting all of us.
Oh, and I think that is such a good point. As you see these hiring signs every place you go every day, this is a great reminder. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking with David Broder, who is the president of SEIU 512 here in Virginia. So there were some other statutes, policies, laws that went into effect July 1 here in Virginia that further put burdens on employers to do the right thing. That's how I'm going to talk about these laws. Employers have to do the right thing. Again, elections matter, ladies and gentlemen, and you get better laws and better policies when you elect people who care about these things. So one of these things that was interesting is that you can't withhold from an employee's paycheck anything other than standard, required withholding for like Social Security or anything the employee has agreed to, like health insurance. Because what was happening is if your drawer was short, let's say at a hotel, they would deduct it from your paycheck. No matter whose fault it was, it didn't matter. If it was short, they just took it from you. And so now there's a law saying they can't do that. So two things come to mind here. We should have policies that protect workers, whether there's in a union or not. And the fact that we never had these, and the list is easy to find. The Richmond Times-Dispatch put out a great article talking about all the ways employers need to be in compliance right away. But here's what I see, is if employers are not in compliance, it relies on a single employee knowing their rights, knowing the law, and knowing the process to file a claim, follow the claim through with whatever agency so that, the employer is brought to bear, the transgression. How often does that happen? It doesn't. It doesn't. The kinds of workers whose wages are being improperly withheld from them are not the people who are going to bring their employer to bear the cost of not being in compliance with the law. And again, I would go back to why unions? Because you have a whole structure and organization who does this for you.
Absolutely, right? It is fantastic that Virginia has passed laws to combat wage theft. And it's fantastic that the administration would invest in more staff to enforce it. But we'll never have enough, because those employers, and it's not everyone, I want to be clear, but those unscrupulous employers who commit wage theft are doing so intentionally, and they're taking advantage of the workers they feel are most vulnerable, right? They do that intentionally in workforces dominated by immigrant workers. They do so women workers, low wage workers, right? And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, but your boss is stealing, from your wages, and the example you gave, or not giving you your tips, yes, you can complain, right? People would say, well, you should quit and get another job or go back to school. I would love for people to live in those workers' shoes. You can't just quit. You still have bills to pay. You have a family to provide for. You're going back the next day. So you're absolutely right. We need better enforcement mechanisms. And I love that you lift up unions, which really are just workers, right? When workers organize together, when we are stronger together, as we like to say, we have that ability to enforce these policies, and it benefits everyone. You don't need every single worker unionized in an economy, but we've seen at the height of the labor movement, when about 1 in 3 workers were in a union, that was sufficient to raise wages for everybody in the community. It's why it's so important that the community support workers that are voluntarily coming together to form a union, whether that's Amazon workers in Bessemer or whether that's your local teachers. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that right now we are at one of the most exciting moments in labor history in Virginia, where after 44 years, the legislature, at the behest of workers, repealed the ban on collective bargaining for local governments. For 44 years, Virginia's local teachers, firefighters, the health department staff who have been working round the clock to give vaccines, they have been banned from having collective bargaining. Something that was so outside of the mainstream. 47 other states in DC allowed collective bargaining. Only Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina didn't, right? So that meant that Mississippi was more progressive than us. Alabama was more progressive, not to pick on southern states, but these states we don't think of as being progressive when it comes to workers were way ahead of us. It's why Oxfam America found that Virginia was the worst state for workers' rights in the entire country. The legislature, under the leadership of Speaker Fillicorn, Senate Majority Leader Dick Saslaw, big shout outs to Elizabeth Guzman on this bill, repealed that ban. But now it is up to local governments to pass collective bargaining ordinances. So if you think your kid's teacher should be able to bargain for PPE, for better class textbooks, for a living wage, if you think your community's librarians and firefighters and nurses should have good retirement benefits, then I invite you to call on your board of supervisors, call on your local school board to pass meaningful collective bargaining. Here in Fairfax, where you and I are sitting, Catherine, even if we're in different places right now, the Board of Supervisors is so close. And so we applaud their leadership, but it's time for them to bring home a meaningful collective bargaining ordinance for pay, benefits, and working conditions for all workers. And we hope the school board will be the next to take that up, because we know that collective bargaining is good for the entire community. And the last thing I'll say is we also know it saves lives. There was a study during the pandemic. Nursing homes that had collective bargaining, that had union contracts, saw 30% fewer deaths than those without a union. And it's a stunning number. And yet it totally makes sense. If you have the right to bargain, enforce a seat at the table, for PPE, for safe, clean work sites, for a living wage so you don't have to work 2 or 3 other jobs where you might get sick, then you're going to have a safer environment for the older adults you care for. It's true in every industry. It's what we want for our community. So we need collective bargaining now in Fairfax County, in every single community in Virginia.
That is impressive. 30%. I mean, they say the proof is in the pudding. And it's very hard to argue with data, and that's impressive data.
Yeah.
For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking with David Broder, who is the president of SEIU 512. So when I ask our listeners to think about the benefits of unions and collective bargaining, which you so beautifully articulated, the benefits, I also ask people to think in terms of, this is not us versus them. This is not workers versus their employers or businesses or industries. This is, how do we make it better for everybody? Stronger together. How can businesses win? How can their workers win? How can families win? And until it happens to you, you may not think that you need the protections of a union, or you may not think you need, collectively power behind policies. But this is an interesting one that I'll throw out for you, David, that came up recently. There are workers who go on leave and who are, so they're on maybe medical leave, right? But then they're required by their employer to work while on leave. And then the employer says, well, we're not paying you because you are on leave. And I didn't realize how common that is until I have an adult child who happens to run payrolls who said, oh no, that is very common. I'm like, you are kidding me. And no. And so what do you do in a case like that? What is your recourse if you are a person, you talked about wage theft, and you're in a white collar job, right? Not a low wage worker, not an hourly worker. You're in a white collar job and you just found out that your employer's like, yeah, you're on leave. We're not paying you, even though we required you to work.
I think this is a great example of what unchecked corporate power is doing to our country. We think about these exploitive practices, and you and I have talked about them largely in frontline blue collar work, but they impact all of us: public sector, private sector, blue collar, white collar, whatever color gig work is these days, or no collar because you're working from home in a t-shirt. It's impacting all of us, and it's simply abusive practices that workers are facing. And people who say, well, if you want a better job, you go get an education, go better yourself. And so I point to higher ed. Workers in higher ed, adjunct professors, are the most educated people I know. And yet they are being exploited as universities and colleges move to a system reliant on adjunct professors. When you add up the number of hours it takes to put together a syllabus, to teach that class, they're making minimum wage. So I think they're really showing where, again, whatever work you do, we are being exploited. And we need to stand up together and demand better jobs for everyone. And that, yes, you might be in a white collar job, but making sure, right, that those who flip burgers and pour coffee have good jobs is going to help you too. Specifically to those folks, if you've got a union, make sure you call your union. So many people don't. Reach out to, make sure you understand the laws and policies. Talk to your coworkers. Reach out to a local union. Reach out to a local legal aid justice center. There are resources. Nobody should have to go through this alone. We really are stronger together. And the boss, right? And they're good bosses, but the boss is counting on you to not do anything about it, right? They're counting on you to suffer in silence, to be quote unquote grateful you have a job. And we've got to push back on that.
And so what do you say to someone who claims that unionizing might make a business fail? Is there any data or historical evidence that unions have led to businesses failing?
There is great evidence that unions strengthen the workforce, strengthen local economies. When workers have health care, right, they are more productive on the job. As you pointed out, when workers make a living wage, they put that money right back into the economy. Let's just tackle the big one. People say, oh, the American auto industry, once great, went down because of unions. Couldn't be farther from the truth. There are a lot of challenges that the American auto industry faces and some bad decisions they made about the kind of cars that they were going to build. But anyone who grew up in Michigan will tell you that their community was strong when unions were strong because it benefited everyone. We have a union member who talks about the union making her childhood better. And I say, oh, were your parents in the auto union? She said, no, my dad was a doctor. I said, wait, your dad was a doctor? She said, yes, my dad was a doctor. The only reason anyone could ever afford to pay us was because everybody worked in the plants and they all had health care. She said, I grew up, my dad had work because everyone had healthcare. So we know that unionizing a workforce is good for businesses. There are a lot of lies that they tell. They say that it'll it'll force jobs overseas. It'll force us to mechanize work and automate work. Again, let's be real. Large corporate interests have been outsourcing work for as long as we can. It has nothing to do with whether the workers get to bargain a contract. There are a lot of supermarkets that are trying to move to automated tellers. That has nothing to do with whether or not the people who work there have health care. If we're going to turn around this economy, then we need workers to have a voice. I'll say this lastly. When it came to the pandemic, when it was terrifying, it's still terrifying. It was workers we turned to. It wasn't corporate CEOs. It was the nurses. It was the teachers. It was the trash collectors, right? It was the frontline workers, blue collar, white collar, who showed up every day and kept our society running. You're going to tell me everything's going to collapse if those frontline workers make a living wage? I don't buy it.
No, I agree. And you point out something incredibly important here about, the auto industry and the fact that globalization meant that cars were coming into the US that were manufactured elsewhere. And so when we talk about globalization, there's been a lot of downsides to that, but that is evolution. And there's not anything we can do to turn back the clock. But going forward, it should not be a race to the bottom either. And it's interesting that one of the things that recently has come about is that 130 different countries have agreed to a minimum corporate income tax. How about them apples? Okay, so maybe you can't control everything. For instance, telephone operators don't exist anymore. And while telephone operators might have been unionized and gotten great benefits at one time, they don't exist because we don't need them anymore. And keep that in mind. There are going to be certain industries where artificial intelligence or automation may in fact take those jobs. But guess what? People go on to different jobs. The question is not what we do with truck drivers. If long haul trucking is autonomous, it's like, what are the transportation jobs of the future, the good paying jobs? What kind of training does somebody need to get a good paying transportation job of the future? We need to be asking better questions.
Absolutely. And we need to be intentional about it. One of the reasons I think the Green New Deal is so popular and why all people, but younger people in particular, feel so passionate about it is they recognize we need to be intentional about the new green jobs of the future being good jobs. Young people know the kind of economy that they've inherited. They are deeply worried about the warming of the planet. We're seeing that this summer. They're also deeply worried about not having enough money, right, to be able to raise a family, simply to have the same kind of life their parents did, let alone better. And so I think when we connect the intentionality of good union jobs with the environmental movement, with the desire for civil rights and more racially equitable world, we are seeing just how powerful these movements are. And I have to say one other thing. We are talking in the middle of a big election year in Virginia. Maybe the rest of the country is taking the year off, but we are together here. Virginians are going to vote this November. What's the direction of our Commonwealth as they vote for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and state house? And so I just want to say, if anyone listening out there, if you're not moved by how important it is to have good union jobs for everyone, how good it is for the economy, let me just tell you, it is deeply, deeply popular.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that time is going to show us that these good policies coming out of this legislature, the last 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, we're going to find that these things are moving the Virginia economy forward. And again, we need to support elected officials who support workers as well as corporations. And it's not one versus the other. And we need to get out of thinking that it has to be this or that. It is a false dichotomy. And we haven't talked about the dropping birth rate in this country. It is significant. It is serious. And to your point, David, I've got 3 adult children in their 30s who are not parents. And more people are saying, I can't afford it. I can't afford to work. We can't afford a house. I can't afford to pay off my student debt. I can't afford childcare. We can't afford it. Well, ultimately, this cripples this nation. it cripples the United States. It cripples Virginia. So people need to think in terms of, and we can do this and we can do that. We can meet the needs of, corporate entities, and we can meet the needs of workers. We can put money in the pockets of workers who put it back in the economy, by, their tax dollars, giving teachers a better salary. Think about social workers. We haven't talked about social workers. They have to go to so much school to be social workers. They're the most educated people in the world who earn practically nothing. This is wrong-headed thinking. And we as ordinary citizens of the planet Earth need to think differently about employment and about education and about what we expect from people and what we're willing to pay people.
Absolutely. And when elected officials and candidates stand up for working people, right, that's what the voters are looking to see. The Democrats took their majority in Richmond running on the minimum wage, running on stronger worker protections, running on making Virginia not just the best place for business, but the best place for working families. And we know these policies are popular. Ralph Northam was the first candidate to run for governor on a $15 minimum wage. Do you know how popular that was? Ed Gillespie's campaign never raised it. They never attacked him because they read the polling. They did their own polling. They knew how popular it was. That's why voters in deep red states have supported raises for the minimum wage. Same thing on collective bargaining. A recent nonpartisan poll shows that nearly 7 in 10 Virginians, 68% of Virginians, that's Democrats, independents, and Republicans, support the right of public employees to come together in a union and bargain a contract. Time after time, we've seen unions, according to the Gallup and Pew polls, are at 50-year highs in popularity. Everybody wants a better economic future for themselves and their kids. They know that unions are fighting for everyone, and candidates who fight alongside with working people are going to do very well in November. And those who are going to be on the side of hedge managers and private equity, like Glenn Youngkin, are going to be in for a rude awakening.
That is a great final thought, David Broder. Please use your vote. A lot of people gave a lot for you to have it. And even though it's an off-year election and Virginia struggles against that, please don't be the person who stays home this year, because workers in Virginia, businesses in Virginia, families and communities in Virginia depend on how you vote this year. Thank you so much, David Broder. This has been Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax every Thursday night at 9 p.m.